In today's reading and throughout the Gospels, Jesus seems to turn everything upside down as he bucks a very popular attitude found earlier, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, and present in his day and in ours, namely, that physical and material well-being are signs of God's blessings upon particular people. Being rich, full, happy, and well-respected was considered to be blessed by God. And conversely, being poor, hungry, sorrowful, and rejected were considered to be God's punishments and curses for some earlier misdeeds. In his Sermon on the Mount, or Plain, depending on whether you're reading Matthew's or Luke's Gospel, Jesus bucks this perspective in his opening remarks, which we call the Beatitudes, by completely reversing this popular notion of blessings and woes. Here he repudiates not only the notion that the poor and downtrodden deserve their unfortunate state, he also repudiates the linkage between God's blessings and those who are full and seem to have it all. But having done this, Jesus is not simply overturning the whole order of things and now blessing the poor because of their poverty and cursing the rich because of their wealth. He is not doing that. Instead, he has a more comprehensive message that affects everyone equally, though not in exactly the same way. He is calling each and everyone to whom he gives a blessing or a woe to look at where their sense of blessedness, their sense of self-worth or value really lies. To those who have little or nothing left to lose, he says, "Blessed are you," hoping that they might more readily see their sense of self-worth, their blessedness, their God-given belovedness, rooted in God's unconditional love, even if their worst fears have been realized. And to those who are wealthy, full, well-respected, his statements of woe to you express not a judgment against wealth and social respectability in themselves, but rather express the same hope that these people will not wrap their sense of self-worth and value, their sense of blessedness and belovedness around the pursuit of wealth, fullness, happiness, and respectability, but rather on God, in whom lies their deepest sense of meaning and worth, no matter what their circumstances. We are in the season traditionally focused on the stewardship of our time and talents and treasures in service to Christ and his church. This is not so easy a subject, especially the money part. For many, the discussion of money is surrounded by as many taboos and proprieties as was the subject of sex in Victorian society. We haven't made a whole lot of progress since 1844, when Ralph Waldo Emerson observed, quote, "Money is hardly spoken of in parlors without apology." In an interesting article written by James Knight, professor of psychiatry at Tulane University School of Medicine, he states, quote, "Patients show far less resistance in relating hatred for their parents or in disclosing sexual perversities than in discussing their money status or transactions. It is as if they equated money with their inmost being. End quote. So money is imbued with a lot of meaning, economically, but also psychically and spiritually. Money, though, was not the issue in general for Jesus. In the New Testament record, money and possessions in themselves are seen as neither bad nor good. It all depends on the use made of them, as well as the motives, beliefs, and the actions or inactions of their owners, as well as how they were obtained in the first place. Great possessions are seen as a danger, but not a sin. At times, as in today's gospel account, Jesus spoke much about the perils and possibilities of wealth. But at other times, it seemed trivial to him. He did stress that the meaning of our lives and our true security do not come from the money we earn or the assets we build or the stuff we accumulate or from the privilege and prestige we obtain. Rather, according to Jesus, material wealth is made meaningful only by what we do with it. Contrary to the popular belief that riches were a sign of God's blessing and favor, wealth to Jesus derives any merit or demerit from the service or disservice that such wealth renders. In other words, does it serve God's kingdom, God's purposes of justice and compassion? Does it serve the common good or just one's own? Is it used in the most effective way of stewardship or further self-indulgence? According to Jesus, money is a lot like the rest of our lives. What you give away is finally what you keep. And where a person's treasure is, there also is their heart. And there never seems to be enough, even for ourselves, until we start sharing. Paradoxical and true. Yet, so often, our very concern for a happy life makes us unhappy, anxious, though all the while we claim to be just on the point of attaining happiness. Even when we have all that we not only need but desire, our anxieties of death and loneliness, meaninglessness and condemnation can still make our lives unbearable. We are very good at preparing to live, but not very good at living. We know how to sacrifice, for example, many years for a diploma, and we are willing to work very hard to get and keep a good job, a house and car, and other assets and items. But we sometimes have difficulty remembering that we are alive right now, which is the only moment there is for us to be alive. Or as Frederick Buechner put it, the biggest problem of wealth, Jesus observed, is that there are people who use up their entire lives making money so that they can enjoy the lives they have entirely used up. Thus, whether we are well off or poor or somewhere in the middle, we must see that money is a good servant, but a poor master. And that reminds me of the Responsible Wealth Project. Responsible Wealth is a national network of business people, investors, and affluent Americans who are concerned about deepening economic inequality and are working for widespread prosperity. With people such as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett involved, this network of several thousand wealthy entrepreneurs and heirs are advocating for a more fair distribution of wealth through three primary ways beyond their foundation's work, namely through corporate responsibility, promotion of family-sustaining living wages, and tax fairness through the preservation, not elimination, of wealth taxes, including income, capital gains, and estate taxes. These members of the Responsible Wealth Project are inspiring generosity instead of greed, and responsibility instead of selfishness, as they neither hoard nor waste their surplus, but rather put it in motion, in service to others, thus helping improve the lives of millions. Regrettably, in this gospel scene we read today, Jesus observed and commented on the excess pride and self-satisfaction of certain other well-to-do persons who had no intention of concealing their generosity, which in fact made no dent in their wealth anyway. Contrasted with this was the discretion and humility of a poor widow Jesus saw, who dropped 2 small coins into the offering plate, drawing from her own want. Of the 2 offerings Jesus observed at the temple treasury, which did he prefer? Well, already in the time of Jesus, there was a rabbinic teaching that stated, quote, 2 turtle doves offered by a poor person are worth more than 1,000 sacrifices of King Agrippa. Jesus confirmed this. The poor widow, in essence, gave more of her very self because she gave in greater proportion of her resources. In fact, she would have to go without anything. And the way she gave, in discretion and humility, was more in keeping with the values of the kingdom of God Jesus was talking about. Jesus himself was to give everything he had and was for all of us. To paraphrase a prayer written by William Penn, since what we have and who we are gifts of God, what God has given us, God has not lost in giving. And so what we give back to God and to others in our time, attention, material gifts, we have not lost by our giving. For what is ours is God's, and what is God's is ours, if we are God's. And again, like the loaves and fishes, there never seems to be enough, even for ourselves, until we start sharing. And it is only our lives given away for love's sake that makes life really worth living. The widow and Jesus knew this. What do we know? Well, we know that Jesus also spoke of and lived as if God's creation is one of abundance, where there is plenty to give and share. It seems so simple, and yet we make it so difficult. We live in a world where the gap between scarcity and abundance grows wider every day. Whether at the level of nations or neighborhoods, this widening gap between rich and poor is polarizing people, making each camp more and more suspicious and antagonistic toward the other. But the peculiar and ironic thing is that the ones with the abundance more or less rely on an ideology of scarcity, while many suffering from scarcity often rely on an ideology of abundance, like the poor widow in our gospel. How can that be? Is there enough to go around? Enough money, food, water, shelter, space? An ideology of scarcity says no, there's not enough. So hold on to what you have. In fact, don't just hold on to it. Put aside more than you need, so that if you do need it, it will be there, even if others must do without. An affirmation of abundance says the opposite. Appearances notwithstanding, there is enough to go around, so long as each of us takes only what we need. If we are willing to have but not hoard, there will even be more than enough left over. This understanding has us look first at the abundance and scarcity we each carry within our own hearts, and at the wealth and poverty of our global and nearby communities. And building bridges across each of those extends our identities as givers. So ultimately, this isn't about money. This is about our faith and what we can leave behind for those who follow us. It's about overcoming our resistance to discovering ourselves as givers. Simply put, we are created to give, and we live in a world in which there is always something to give. In Genesis, we read that God created us, male and female, in God's own image. Thus, we are a reflection of God. We reflect God's creativity. We reflect God's love. We reflect God's generosity. It's in our very being. We are created to be generous and creative and loving and responsible and compassionate. It's who we really are. And so, as we live and give of ourselves, we discover fulfillment in truly being ourselves. There is a felt balance about it. We live, we give, as givers to God's glory. So, may I remind us all to go ahead, act, be generous. Let us become fully the givers we are and are meant to be. Amen.